Colonel Vindman, you are one of those people who you came from a part of the world that was not enjoying democracy, and you saw something as a person who worked in the administration. You saw something that felt dishonest, and you stood up. You had something to lose, and you did lose something. You lost your career for doing it. But that was what when you said, we can't have this lawlessness that goes on in the other parts of the world in America.
But I think, in a lot of ways, we're seeing both Trump telegraph the kind of world he wants to live in, and then we don't have to use our imagination too hard because we could see that world manifest in front of us because Trump tells us he wants to emulate Vladimir Putin. And in that, we see what life could be like. We see a world in which Trump would like to eliminate his opposition. He'd like to imprison them, poison them, potentially murder them. Mass deportation. We saw that play out in regards to Russia. And what I fear and what I frankly desperately hope doesn't happen is that we don't have to have our population come out in thousands or tens of thousands to protest against barbarism in the United States. It's striking that over the course of 2 years of war, Putin has done everything he could to suppress that population, to oppress that population, and think he's cowed them. And clearly that's not the case. People were out on the street chanting against the war, chanting for Alexei Navalny and for a different vision of Russia. And again, I do not wish to see anything like that happen in the United States. And that's why you hear me and you hear Ambassador McFaul, who I had the privilege of serving with in Moscow, are so focused on making sure that war over there doesn't come home to the United States, that our troops don't get pulled in, and that we protect democracy at home.
Ambassador, let's talk about this idea that we are 2 weeks away from an election in which there has never been any doubt that Vladimir Putin will be the victor. Why does this stuff still happen? Why are those people prepared to go out there? They know who the next president of Russia is going to be. They know from, as Colonel Vindman said, they know from the outbreak of the Ukraine war and other demonstrations in favor of Navalny or supporting his efforts. They know you can go to jail for this in Russia, and yet they come. Yet they come knowing that they may face arrest or harassment or worse.
Well, I have deep admiration for all the people that did come on this horrific day, for all of Russia, for the Navalny family. For me personally, I know the Navalny family. I knew Alexei personally for many years. He was a tremendously talented leader. He was the Mandela. He was the Havel. He was the Valensa of his country, with one horrible, tragic difference. He was killed in prison. He was not released. And to answer your question, I would say, just remember what Navalny said in the movie at the end of it. If they have to kill me, and if I'm dead, that means we're stronger than you know we are. We're stronger than you think we are. Something to that effect. And I think what you saw today, because you're absolutely right, every single one of those people are being photographed. They can go to jail for years for what they were chanting. I have friends in jail in Russia right now who have gone to jail for years for chanting what they said, but they are defying him. And for everyone that was there, there are many, many more sitting in their kitchens that are afraid but have exactly the same preferences. And I think we have to remember that not all Russians think like Putin. Mm-hmm. Not all Russians support Putin.
Vladimir Kara-Murza told me, Colonel Vindman, he told me years ago, he said, when talking about these stories, don't say Russians. Talk about Putin. Talk about the Russian administration. Don't paint all Russians with the same brush. And the same thing can be said for America right now, for a lot of people around the world who are looking at us saying, what are you people doing? It's not all of us people. There are people in America who protest every day. There are people who protest the injustices, who fight it by running for office, who fight it by being in office. So this is not a fight we have lost in America yet. We have the vote. Our vote actually does matter, and we can make changes, but it takes acts of courage to do this.
I think that's true. I think, frankly, we might have only one more vote left that really matters. If Trump comes to office, he's already declared that he intends to be a dictator. The president and the chief executive is invested in broad powers, and it's not easy to undo American democracy that's been around for nearly 250 years. But a lot of damage has been done, and President Trump has every intention to do that. So we have one more vote. We need to make sure our population shows up. So like this, we don't have to face those challenges in the oppression that the Russians are facing. I think the fact is that between now and then, it's going to be a particularly difficult period. There are steps that need to be taken to make sure that the war between Russia and Ukraine doesn't spill over, doesn't magnify. That the highest risk of that happening, frankly, is if Ukraine doesn't get support. The Republican Party must show up in an effort to support and advance U.S. national security and pass a Ukraine aid package, same aid package that would support Taiwan and Israel. But it's critically important that Ukraine gets aid. Otherwise, there's a very, very big risk that the war could spill over. President Macron of France alluded to something of this nature. Worst case scenario, in the absence of the U.S., in which Europe has no choice but to face off against Russia in Ukraine, so like this, they don't have to face off against Russia on their own territory.
So this is an important point you bring up, because one would say President Macron, Ambassador, is the president of France, a NATO country. Why would Russia go into a NATO country? I want to remind our viewers of what Donald Trump said on February 10th in South Carolina about a nameless NATO leader who said, if we don't pay what you say we're supposed to pay, which is a sort of a misrepresentation to start with, will you protect us if Russia does something? And here's what former President Trump said.
No, I would not protect you. In fact, I would encourage them to do whatever the hell they want.
So there you have it, Ambassador. As the Colonel says, we don't have to really stretch our minds too much to imagine what Donald Trump would do in these cases, because he tells us what he would do.
Well, he does, and that is really scary for me for the following reasons. He may say that, and he may encourage Putin to go in to one of the countries on the border there. But the idea that we will stay out of that conflict, that is naive beyond imagination. It reminds me of the 1930s, when people just like Trump said, that's not our problem over there. Doesn't matter what the Italians are doing in Ethiopia or the Japanese in China or Hitler in Poland. And then it became our problem.
Right.
And I was just in Munich last week speaking to leaders from that part of the world, and in Vilnius the month before. They are scared to death of that scenario when Putin tests our commitment to Article 5 and we have a president perhaps like Mr. Trump. And it is naive for Americans to think that we will be able to keep out of a war in Europe. Better to be strong now. Ronald Reagan said it, peace through strength, than to wait for that scenario to play out. And don't believe me, just go back and read what happened in the 1930s, punctuated by what happened to us in 1941.
Ali, if I could come in on this. I just want to, the danger is frankly more real than that. This is not a what-if scenario. What happens if Donald Trump is back in office in 2025? The threat is real, because what Donald Trump has done is he's offered a signal that the Republican Party, not just Trump in the future, but the Republican Party today would not show up in the event of an attack on NATO. And that's a recipe for disaster. That's an invitation for Putin to test that resolve. He's been wanting to destroy NATO for the whole time, to test that resolve. And that's a recipe for our troops to be in danger today, because we would defend him, but he might not perceive it that way. And that's the same kind of scenario that unfolded in the weeks and months before February 2022, where Putin believed he saw the signal that the Republican Party, the political establishment in the United States, wouldn't show up, and he struck out at Ukraine. We're kind of in that same situation now. It is very dangerous. It is very real. And even in the months before this election, I think our troops are now in much greater danger than they were beforehand.
That's a remarkable perspective on that. Ambassador, you and Colonel Vindman are both students of history. One doesn't have to go too far back in history. You can go back to September 11th, 2001, to the one and only time that Article 5, the mutual defense article of NATO, was invoked. And it was invoked in the defense of the United States of America by every other member nation who said, you have been attacked, so we have been attacked. We're here for you.
That's right. I'm glad you reminded me, everyone, of that. I don't think Mr. Trump understands that. And by the way, they didn't just invoke Article 5. They send their soldiers to fight with us and to die with us in Afghanistan. So when I hear all this debate about 2%, 2.1%, I want to remind everybody that our NATO allies died for us. We have not had to fight for them, and we're all better off. The one great advantage we have as the United States of America when dealing with Russia or dealing with China, are our allies. It's our one superpower. We have allies and they don't. So why Donald Trump doesn't understand that basic fact about our national security, I know the Republicans do around him. I know they're just afraid of him. I wish they would speak up. And to go back to your analogies between Trump and Putin, I actually wrote a piece about that, Ollie, in February of 2017. And it wasn't how in Russia, the civil society activists were there, the opposition parties were there. You know who was quiet? It was the people in his party, the oligarchs, and those that allegedly listen to his Christian values, right? Well, he's not so bad. He's going to cut our taxes, and he speaks about Christian things that we care about. That's what they said in the early years of Putin, and it's eerily similar to what I hear now. So it's those people being silent that need to speak up before it's too late.
Katie, let me start with you and Georgia and the stakes in this case and what you heard today and what it makes you think.
So it was closing arguments, Ali, and it was 3 hours of closing arguments, which was remarkable, but not really if you consider the fact that there are so many defendants. And I guess the footnote to that would be the import of this case. I mean, it started with 19 co-defendants. It's a RICO case with multiple other offenses. You've already had 4 of those co-defendants played out, some of whom were critical to the scheme to defraud and to try to overturn the Georgia election results. And the reason why I talk about that is because we cannot lose sight of the fact that that is what this prosecution is about. We have taken somewhat of a circus sideshow detour over the span of a number of weeks now to be able to litigate a motion to disqualify, which in any jurisdiction would be serious, but in this particular jurisdiction, it has such import, as you discussed in the setup, Ali, because if Fani Willis is disqualified under Georgia law and procedure, her entire office is disqualified, and then you have to wait an innumerable amount of time for a reassignment, and then the ultimate prosecutorial discretion of that new DA as to whether or not they want to pursue all of the charge and some or none. But after these 3 hours of closing arguments, what we were left with, those of us that have been carefully observing, was the fact that Judge McAfee had a series of questions that he peppered to the defense and not so much to the state. And what he focused on, for me as a lawyer and somebody who tried cases in multiple courts, is the following. You know, you have to have a burden of proof. You know, Jack Smith, for example, when he takes Donald Trump and others to trial, will have the burden of proof to prove his case beyond and to the exclusion of every reasonable doubt. It's a lower burden in this evidentiary hearing scenario, but there's a burden nonetheless, but it's not on the prosecution. It's on the defense. And when you heard the judge ask the defense about whether or not, you know, they understood that something that is suggestive of wrongdoing is not a preponderance of the evidence standard, it made you stop and consider the fact that the judge is carefully weighing the evidence in this case, the testimony that's been provided by a number of witnesses, including DA Fani Willis herself and Special Prosecutor Nathan Wade. But it's worth mentioning quickly, Ali, that the star witness for the defense, and in fact, he was called the star witness by the judge himself because there was these huge promises that were over-delivered by the defense in terms of Terrence Bradley, the former divorce attorney for Nathan Wade. He's the only witness that took the stand twice during the course of this evidentiary hearing, and he was just a big womp-womp for the defense in the end. He refused to corroborate or to affirm what the defense said, which is that he had provided all of this very salacious kind of information behind the scenes about his former client, Nathan Wade. The defense is saying that Fani Willis still got a personal financial benefit. But when the judge asked the defense, well, can you define that? The defense said, well, it's like obscenity. Judge, you know it when you see it. I mean, Ali, that's not an evidentiary standard. Right. That's not evidence. And I think that is what is going to be the important thing for the judge. What is the evidence? Can you tune out the white noise? Can you tune out the pressure, all of the potential optics of a decision, and can you base it on the evidence? And I submit to you that I think the judge in this case is going to do that, and we're going to get a ruling in the next 2 weeks.
That much he's told us, Andrew. What we don't have is when the Florida judge, Aileen Cannon, is going to give us a ruling. And look, one of the things she's become known for is she takes her time with stuff and has been somewhat sympathetic to the Trump legal team's constant requests for more time and more things. But today they got shut down, at least on one front, by the Jack Smith team about this idea that you can't start a trial within a couple months of an election. Obviously, you know a lot about these things.
Sure. I think that there's no question that Judge Cannon, in her rulings, has favored the defense. Even her reasoning has gone out of its way to find fault with the government and to side wherever possible with the defense in ways that I think continue to be pretty shocking. Remember, she is the judge who was reversed twice by the 11th Circuit before the case was indicted. We do not know the trial date. She did make various comments saying that she thought that the date that was sought by the government in July was unduly optimistic, and she asked a lot of questions of the defense about not having a trial at all, and certainly not in the lead up to the election. I was surprised she even brought up the DOJ internal rule, because the internal rules of the department don't in any way give rights to the defense. They're not enforceable in any court. They're just internal guides to the Department of Justice. And that's something that the judge knows very well, having worked as a prosecutor. So it really was none of her business to raise that. And also, the rule simply does not apply. The rule is about not taking overt actions with respect to someone who's a political candidate shortly before an election. Why? Because you want to give that person an opportunity to have their day in court. Well, this is the reverse. This is an overt case where the government is seeking to have that trial, is seeking to have a day in court. So there was every reason for this not to apply and not for the judge to raise it in court.
There's a lot here to unpack. And Nick, you wrote an op-ed on this in the New York Times. We don't even have to have an interview. You can just read the title of your op-ed. It says, Biden can do better than airdropping food to Gaza. There's a lot that we can do better on. President Biden said we will not stand by and we will not let up, except we have stood by and we have let up.
We have stood by. Exactly. Yeah, I mean, we have stood by, and there is some inherent contradiction in us helping provide the weaponry that creates the destruction and helping provide the diplomatic protection to Israel as it blocks aid, and then us moving in to try to drop aid on a crisis that we have helped create, and one in which many of the victims are children who bear no responsibility for the terrorist attack on October 7th.
Let's talk about what we can do better. And I will give Joe Biden credit for being possibly the most optimistic man on earth in thinking there's going to be a deal. There are the outlines of a deal. It's not coming together, and Benjamin Netanyahu says, as often as he is asked, that it's not the kind of thing he's going to do. So let me say what you've written about in your article. You've said the simplest path forward would be for Biden to insist that Israel open more crossing points, allow many more trucks through, permit civilian police escorts, and accept that UNRWA and aid groups will play a central role in food distribution. That would be less visual than an airdrop, but it would save far more lives. Expand on that, please.
So one reason for the tragedy yesterday was that Israel apparently did not want to have food aid delivered through UNRWA, the UN organization that it has made a lot of allegations against, and that may well have had 12 people participate in the October 7th attacks. It has also been reluctant to work with traditional aid agencies. And so it apparently had contractors protected by Israeli tanks try to go in. And look, the people who know how to deliver aid are those aid agencies, including UNRWA. They have those people on the ground, that network. And what you need to make airdrops work, and I've seen them, is also that group, those people on the ground who collect pallets when they're dropped, who protect it from just some random gunman seizing it. If you just drop food aid, who's going to get it? It's going to be Hamas, not the most vulnerable people. And right now, the most vulnerable people in Gaza are kids. And, the toll there, it just, I've covered a lot of crises around the world, but 250 children under the age of 1 have died so far in Gaza. I can't think of any recent conflict in this century in which that many kids have died that quickly in a war.